Welcome back to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we break down complex legal concepts.
Making them clear and easy to understand for all you law students out there.
Exactly.
And today we're tackling a topic that's crucial for any law student here in India.
Restrictions on alienation of property.
It sounds a bit intimidating, right? But think of it this way.
It's like a deep dive into the rules of the game.
When it comes to transferring property ownership,
Who can get that property baton? And under what conditions?
it's like a relay race, but with legal hurdles.
We'll be exploring how ownership can be transferred, the legal processes involved.
And most importantly, the restrictions that can come into play.
We've all heard about the right to property.
But what happens when that right comes with strings attached?
That's where things get really interesting.
Especially in the Indian legal context.
So let's break it down.
Starting with the basics.
What exactly is alienation of property?
Alienation of property basically means the transfer of ownership rights from one person to another.
Okay, so it's not just about the physical property changing hands.
It's about the legal rights associated with that property being transferred as well.
Got it.
And this transfer can happen in a couple of ways.
Voluntarily.
Like when you sell a house or gift some land to someone.
Or involuntarily.
Like in cases of foreclosure, for example.
So there are different scenarios where this alienation comes into play.
Exactly. Now, you might be thinking, if I own something, shouldn't I have the absolute right to do whatever I want with it?
Like sell it or give it away.
And in many cases, you'd be absolutely right. But Indian law does have certain restrictions on how property can be alienated.
And for us law students, understanding these restrictions is super important.
Absolutely crucial. So let's say, for example, someone wants to sell their land.
But they put in a clause that says the buyer can never resell it.
Would that hold up in an Indian court? No chance.
Really? Why not?
That's what we call an absolute restraint on alienation.
Absolute restraint.
And Section 10 of the Transfer of Property Act of 1882,
The TPA.
it clearly states that these kinds of restraints are void in India.
So even if someone tries to control their property from beyond the grave.
The law steps in and says, nope, property needs to flow.
Interesting. So there's a reason behind this?
There's actually a legal maxim behind this.
Yeah.
Alienatio re prefertur juri accrescendi.
Okay, break that down for us.
It essentially means that alienation
To transfer property.
is preferred over accumulation. It's all about keeping the property market dynamic.
And preventing stagnation.
Exactly.
This makes me think about the economic implications. If we allowed these absolute restraints, wouldn't that create all sorts of problems?
Absolutely. Think about it. If property could be locked within families or specific groups forever,
It would hinder economic growth, right?
and social mobility. Imagine entire neighborhoods where property couldn't be bought or sold on the open market.
That would stifle development.
And investment, for sure.
Not to mention the potential legal headaches. Trying to untangle generations of restrictions on a single property.
It would be a nightmare, like trying to solve a property puzzle.
With missing pieces.
And cryptic clues.
Okay, so we know that absolute restraints are a no-go. But are there any exceptions to this rule?
Are there situations where restrictions on alienation are allowed?
Because it seems like there should be some flexibility.
Yes, you're right. There are certain exceptions. And they often involve specific types of property interests, like leases and conditional fees.
Let's start with leases. I remember you mentioning that landlords often restrict tenants from subletting.
Right, imagine you're a landlord. You've carefully chosen a tenant, but then they want to sublet the property to someone you don't know.
So that's where restrictions come in.
The lease might say that the tenant can't sublet without your permission.
So it's not a complete ban on transferring their leasehold interest, it's just a condition they have to meet.
Precisely. These conditions are generally considered reasonable because they protect the landlord's legitimate interests in their property.
They want to have some control over who's occupying their property.
Right, it's like a safety net for the landlord.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about those conditional fees you mentioned? Those sound a bit more complex.
They can be. Imagine someone grants you a piece of land, but with a condition.
Like you must use it to build a school.
Exactly, that's a conditional fee. You own the property, but your ownership is contingent on fulfilling that specific purpose.
So if you decide to build a shopping mall instead,
You could lose your rights to the land.
it's like getting a gift with very specific instructions on how to use it.
Exactly. These conditions aren't just random whims. They often have social or economic objectives.
Like ensuring that the land is used for a specific purpose.
Exactly. They might be used to ensure the land is used for public benefit
Or to preserve historical sites.
or to promote specific types of development.
So it's not just about individual ownership.
It's about using property law to shape how land is used and developed within a community.
Wow, finding that balance between individual property rights and broader societal goals.
Absolutely, it's a delicate balance.
So far, we've established that alienation is about the transfer of property ownership.
And while absolute restraints are generally void in India, there are exceptions like leases and conditional fees.
Right. Those exceptions are important to keep in mind.
Definitely. But before we go any further, let's actually break down the process of alienation itself.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the legal steps involved in transferring property from one person to another?
Well, you can think of it as a three-legged stool: documentation, registration.
And sometimes court proceedings.
Right. Let's start with documentation. This is especially crucial in voluntary transfers.
So we're talking about things like sale deeds, gift deeds.
Mortgage deeds, exactly. Those documents are essential for creating a clear record of the transaction.
They provide evidence of the transfer, outline the terms, protect everyone's interests.
Absolutely. Having clear, legally sound documentation is crucial for avoiding disputes down the line.
Because imagine trying to prove you bought a property years ago without a proper sale deed.
It would be incredibly difficult.
It's like building a solid legal foundation for the property transfer.
Exactly. And once the documents are in order, we move on to registration.
Which is generally required for most property transfers.
That's right.
So it's not enough to just have a signed agreement.
You need to make it official by registering it with the authorities.
Registration serves as public notice of the transfer, helps prevent fraud.
And plays a crucial role in establishing a clear chain of title.
It's like the official stamp of approval that says, this property transfer is legit.
Exactly. And finally, there are situations where court proceedings might be necessary.
Especially in cases of involuntary alienation, right?
Right.
So if someone's property is being foreclosed on and they believe it's unlawful.
They could go to court to fight it.
Makes sense. The courts provide a platform for resolving these disputes.
And ensuring that all parties are treated fairly.
This is already painting a pretty complex picture, and we've only just scratched the surface.
It is complex, but that's why understanding these concepts is so essential. Not just for future lawyers.
But for anyone dealing with property in India.
Exactly. And before we move on, I want to touch upon something that often gets overlooked.
Okay, what's that?
The practical aspect of finding information on alienated properties. It's like detective work, but for property law.
Property detective work.
Yeah.
That sounds intriguing. Tell me more. How would someone go about finding information on alienated properties?
Well, there are several avenues you can explore. You could start by checking public property records.
Which are typically maintained by government offices.
Right. These records would contain a history of ownership, previous transactions.
Maybe even some juicy details about past disputes.
Oh, absolutely. You can trace the lineage of ownership, see previous transactions.
Sometimes even uncover those fascinating stories behind a particular property.
It's like piecing together a historical puzzle.
I love that, stepping back in time, uncovering those secrets. What other methods could our budding property detectives use?
Another excellent approach is analyzing title deeds.
So not just who owned it, but any legal baggage it might be carrying as well.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand these details before entering into any property transactions. You don't want to buy a property.
Only to discover later that it's tied up in legal knots.
Precisely.
Now, what about those mysterious sub-registrar's offices? What kind of information can we uncover there?
The sub-registrar's office is a treasure trove of information.
Really?
They maintain detailed records of property transfers, providing a clear trail of who owned what and when.
So you can verify the history of a property and ensure that all previous transfers were done by the book. No hidden surprises.
Exactly. And of course, for complex cases or when you need expert analysis, hiring a property lawyer can be invaluable.
They're like the Sherlock Holmes of property law, right?
Precisely. They can conduct a thorough title search, analyze documents, and provide expert opinions on the ownership history and legal standing of a property.
So when in doubt, call in the property law experts. Now, for those who prefer a more hands-on approach, what about those market surveys you mentioned?
Market surveys can be surprisingly insightful.
How so?
Talking to property brokers or real estate agencies can give you a sense of past ownership patterns and provide valuable insights into the history of a particular property or neighborhood.
So you're tapping into the collective knowledge of those who live and breathe the real estate market.
Exactly. They often have a wealth of anecdotal information and market insights that can be very helpful in understanding the history of alienated properties.
They've seen it all. And for those who enjoy a bit of legal drama,
Examining court records can be quite illuminating.
court records. Okay, tell me more.
Court proceedings related to a property, such as disputes over ownership or inheritance, can reveal a fascinating and sometimes contentious history.
It's like stepping into a legal time machine, witnessing those battles fought over a piece of land.
Exactly. It's a reminder that property ownership isn't always straightforward, and that legal disputes can arise even over seemingly simple transactions.
Wow, this deep dive has already opened my eyes to the depth and complexity of restrictions on alienation. It's not just a theoretical concept.
It has real-world implications for everyone involved.
Property owners, buyers, sellers, and anyone involved in the legal aspects of real estate.
Absolutely. And we've only just scratched the surface.
There's still so much more to explore, like the global perspective on these restrictions.
We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive and see how different countries approach these same issues.
Until then, keep those legal minds sharp.
Welcome back to LexTalks.
Now, before we completely shift gears to the global perspective, I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier, the legal and economic implications of allowing absolute restraints on alienation. We touched on it briefly, but I think it's worth exploring a bit further. Like, what would the consequences be?
I agree, it's a crucial point. Allowing absolute restraints could have a ripple effect throughout the entire property market. Imagine if property became locked within certain families or groups for generations. It would create a very different landscape in India.
It would almost be like going back in time, wouldn't it? We'd see a return to a system where land is held within families for generations with limited opportunities for others to enter the market.
Precisely. And that lack of fluidity would have significant economic consequences. It would discourage investment, stifle development, and potentially lead to market stagnation. Property would become less about economic opportunity and more about inherited privilege. Not a good look.
And wouldn't it also create a breeding ground for legal disputes? All sorts of complications.
Absolutely. Imagine trying to untangle generations of complex restrictions placed on a single piece of property. The legal battles would be endless and incredibly costly, and the outcome might not always be fair or equitable.
It sounds like allowing absolute restraints would open a Pandora's box of legal and economic problems.
You could say that. It's clear that the law's decision to generally prohibit such restraints is based on sound reasoning and a desire to protect both individual rights and the overall health of the property market. Makes sense to me.
This conversation has really highlighted the importance of striking a balance between individual freedom and the greater good. It's not just about black and white rules. It's about understanding the nuances, the potential consequences, and the broader impact on society.
Well said. Lawmakers have to carefully consider all sides of the equation when crafting laws related to property. It's about finding that sweet spot where individual rights are respected, but the market remains dynamic and accessible to all.
It's a reminder that law isn't static. It's constantly evolving and adapting to the needs of a changing society.
And speaking of adapting, let's shift our focus back to those global perspectives. We were discussing the Maori Land Act in New Zealand. What's interesting about this act is that it recognizes the collective ownership rights of Maori tribes and groups.
So it's not just about individual ownership. It's about acknowledging the historical and cultural connection that these communities have to their land. That's really fascinating.
Exactly. The act aims to protect Maori land from being alienated outside of the tribe or group, preserving their cultural heritage and connection to their ancestral lands.
It's a powerful example of how property law can be used to protect the rights of indigenous communities and ensure that their cultural heritage is passed down to future generations.
And it highlights the diversity of approaches to property rights around the world. Each country's legal system reflects its unique history, social values, and cultural norms.
This comparative approach is so valuable, isn't it? It allows us to see beyond our own legal system and appreciate the different ways in which societies address similar challenges.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to property law. Each country has to find a solution that works within its own context. Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to touch upon another aspect of property alienation that we often encounter in India, the concept of lis pendens.
This pendants, it rings a bell. It has something to do with the legal disputes in property, right?
Exactly. Lis pendens literally translates to suit pending. It's a legal notice that basically says, hey, there's a lawsuit going on regarding this property, so be aware that any transfer of ownership might be affected by the outcome of the case.
So it's like a warning sign for potential buyers or anyone interested in acquiring that property. Like buyer beware.
Precisely. It protects the interests of all parties involved by making it clear that the property's ownership is in question and that any transaction might be subject to the court's decision.
That makes sense. It prevents people from unknowingly buying a property that's entangled in a legal battle. It's like a legal safety net, ensuring transparency and fairness in property transactions.
Exactly. It's a crucial concept to understand, especially for law students who will be dealing with property law cases in the future. You need to be aware of the potential implications of lis pendens and how it can impact property transfers.
This deep dive is really highlighting the intricate web of legal concepts that surround property alienation. It's fascinating, but I can also see how it can be overwhelming for someone just starting their legal journey.
You're right, it's a lot to take in, but that's why we're here to break down these complex concepts and make them accessible to law students like yourself. And remember, even experienced lawyers are constantly learning and refining their understanding of property law.
It's a journey, not a destination. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch upon a topic that's particularly relevant in India. The role of agricultural land in property alienation. That's a big one.
That's a great point. Agricultural land often has specific regulations and restrictions that differ from those governing residential or commercial properties. For instance, many states have laws that restrict the conversion of agricultural land for non-agricultural purposes.
So you can't just buy a farm and turn it into a shopping mall overnight.
Not that simple. These restrictions are in place to protect agricultural land, ensure food security, and prevent uncontrolled urbanization. They also aim to safeguard the livelihoods of those dependent on agriculture.
It's another example of how property law intersects with broader societal concerns, like environmental protection and economic development.
Precisely. And understanding these nuances is crucial for anyone working with property law in India. You need to be aware of the specific regulations that apply to different types of land and how those regulations can impact alienation.
This deep dive has been incredibly enlightening, but I have a feeling we're just getting started. There's still so much more to explore in the realm of restrictions on alienation.
You're absolutely right. We've covered a lot of ground, but there are still some fascinating areas to delve into. We'll be back soon to continue our deep dive, but until then, keep those legal minds sharp.
Welcome back to LexTalks.
Right.
We've been on quite a journey exploring these restrictions on alienation of property.
Right. From those absolute restraints that are like totally off limits to the exceptions that spice things up.
And we even went global, comparing how different countries approach this whole balancing act.
But before we wrap things up, I want to go back to those exceptions to the rule against absolute restraints.
Yeah, let's dive back into that.
We talked about leases and conditional fees, but maybe some more concrete examples would help our listeners really grasp it, you know?
Absolutely. Give us those real-world scenarios.
Okay, so leases. We mentioned how a landlord might put a restriction on a tenant, like not allowing them to sublet without permission.
Right, pretty common.
But what are some other restrictions you might find in a lease agreement? Like imagine you're leasing a commercial space, say, for a restaurant.
Okay, I'm imagining it.
The landlord might put in a clause restricting you from like completely changing the cuisine without their consent, of course.
That makes sense. Why would they do that?
They want to maintain a certain image for the property, right? Or target a specific audience.
So it's not just about, like, who's physically occupying the space.
It's about how that space is being used.
It's all connected.
The landlord's protecting their investment and the overall character of the property.
Right, like they had a vision when they leased it out. What about like an apartment in a housing society?
Oh, yeah, good one. So the lease might restrict the tenant from making any major changes, like structural alterations, or even something as simple as painting the exterior a different color.
Without the society's approval.
Exactly. It's about keeping things harmonious,
Yeah.
maintaining that aesthetic consistency within the community.
So those restrictions, even though they might seem a bit limiting at first glance, they actually serve a purpose.
Totally. They help prevent disputes, protect everyone's interests, and ensure that the lease agreement runs smoothly.
It's a good reminder that even though those absolute restraints are a no-go, there's still some wiggle room for reasonable conditions.
As long as they're protecting legitimate interests.
Right, that's key. Okay, now those conditional fees, Those can be a bit trickier,
Yeah, a bit more complex. Remember, it's essentially a grant of property, but with certain strings attached.
like those conditions we talked about.
Exactly. Let's say, for example, we have a wealthy businessman who wants to, give back to his village.
Okay, a philanthropist.
He might gift land for a hospital, right? But with a specific condition, it has to stay a free healthcare facility for the villagers
Forever.
in perpetuity. So the ownership of that land is directly tied to fulfilling that charitable purpose.
Wow, so if the trustees decide to turn it into a private hospital down the line,
They could risk losing the land. The original intention, that social good, is baked into the ownership itself.
that's pretty powerful. It's like a legal promise embedded in the property transfer.
Exactly. It's all about upholding that initial vision. Or, let's take historical preservation. A government might grant a heritage building to a trust.
Right? To take care of it.
Exactly. But with the condition that they have to restore it and maintain it, following those specific guidelines, of course.
Makes sense. So the historical significance is preserved.
For generations to come. So even though the trust technically has ownership, they also have certain obligations. It's all about balance
Balancing the rights of ownership.
with the responsibility of preservation.
This has been, wow, such a deep dive. I feel like my understanding of property law in India has really expanded. It's not just about memorizing those dry legal rules. It's about, like, understanding the reasoning behind them.
Absolutely, and how they actually play out in real life scenarios, right?
Property law, it's dynamic, constantly changing, and so deeply connected to what's happening in society. It's fascinating.
It really is. And there's always more to learn and explore.
So much to unpack. This has been an incredibly insightful journey exploring these restrictions on alienation of property.
And we hope our listeners are feeling more confident in navigating this complex area of law.
Knowledge is power, right? Especially in the legal world.
Couldn't agree more.
A huge thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as insightful and engaging as we did.
And don't forget to subscribe to LexTalks for more deep dives into the world of law. There's always a new legal adventure waiting.
Until next time, keep those legal minds sharp.